On the 5th of December, 1496, King Manuel I of Portugal was issued an ultimatum. 4 years earlier, the Kingdom of Castile and the Crown lands of Aragon, united under King Fernando and Queen Isabel, had eradicated the Jews from their territories. Now, if Manuel was to marry their daughter Isabel of Aragon, he had to do the same in his country. Manuel issued the familiar decree for all Jews and Muslims to leave Portugal or accept baptism by October of the next year. But in reality, few were able to escape. Prior to 1492, Portugal's Jewish population had never been very large, confined to just a few thousand scattered between the capital Lisbon and a handful of villages along the Douro River. The vast majority of Jews in Portugal in 1496 were those who had fled expulsion from Spain. In many cases, these refugees included many of the wealthiest traders, the most experienced bureaucrats, and the most educated scholars. What's more, these were people who had chosen to leave Spain rather than convert. Now they would almost certainly choose to leave Portugal, at great cost to the crown. So just weeks after issuing his decree, Manuel reversed his order, forcibly prevented the Jews from leaving the country, and had them converted en masse. Whatever you may say about the Alhambra Decree, the conversos of Spain had genuinely been given the choice to leave and remain Jewish. While some of them may have carried on Jewish traditions behind closed doors, few of their descendants ever did. In the rest of the Jewish world, Spanish conversos were mourned as if they had died, and their descendants ignored as if they had never been born. Portugal was a different story. In the wider Jewish world, there was no question that the Portuguese conversion was coerced and invalid. These people were still Jews, and any doubts of that were put to rest by a century of civil resistance by these so-called New Christians. When Portuguese conversos refused to pay taxes in 1497, 2,000 of their children were taken into royal custody and deported to the new African colony of São Tomé. Only 600 were found alive a year later. In April 1506, a mob of sailors, encouraged by local Dominican monks, massacred 2,000 conversos in Lisbon. In the village of Belmonte, a small community secretly maintained the Jewish tradition right up to the 20th century. And in 1536, King João III established the Portuguese Inquisition to fight back against the tide of defiance. There was another way out. Unlike in Spain, where conversos were largely forbidden from settling in the New World, Portuguese conversos began taking full advantage of their country's burgeoning empire, ostensibly settling in coastal colonies before escaping across the border. The most popular destination for this was southern India, where Jewish communities had already been living since the Second Temple period, but some even reached as far as Nagasaki. Yes, Sengoku-era Japan had Jews. This means of escape was short-lived, as the Inquisition was quick to arrive in the colonies. But there was an inherent flaw to the Inquisition's plans. The entire reason Jews had been forcibly converted was to hold on to the wealth and connections of wealthy Jewish traders. Now, the wealthiest of them all was about to turn the tables. In 1538, a fantastically wealthy black pepper trader named Francisco Mendes died, leaving most of his fortune to his 25-year-old widow, Beatriz de Lona Micash. Beatriz was also his niece, which is pretty gross, but there was an actual reason, a secret that needed to stay in the family. Francisco and Beatriz were not only Jews, but part of an offshoot branch of the Benveniste banking family, with connections all over Europe and Asia. Beatriz's real name was Gracia Mendes Nassi, and by the time of Francisco's death, the family had moved to Antwerp, where Mendes could continue to operate as part of the Portuguese spice trade, but beyond the reach of the Inquisition. Using her massive wealth to avoid close scrutiny by Portuguese authorities, Mendes began smuggling conversos out of Lisbon on her family's ships. Once the escapees arrived in Antwerp, Mendes would give them a set amount of cash and a book of detailed instructions to travel south over the Alps to Venice, from which her contacts there would secure passage into the Ottoman Empire. Among the many people she sent on this journey was her nephew and eventual heir, Joseph. You may know him from the previous video as the Duke of Naxos, for it was he whom Suleiman the Magnificent charged with overseeing the Jewish resettlement of Palestine. By the time Mendes herself had arrived in Constantinople, much of her fortune had been lost in a legal settlement with an in-law who rejected the family's reversion to Judaism. However, her renown in the Ottoman Empire made her one of the country's foremost diplomats, successfully pressuring Pope Pius V to stop the execution of Jews in the Papal States, and eventually obtaining a lease to resettle Jewish refugees in Tiberias. She died in 1569 and is considered a national hero of both Israel and Turkey. Mendes's death dealt a crushing blow to the project of rescuing conversos. But in the course of her later life, events were unfolding that would enable the liberation of more Portuguese Jews than she could have ever imagined. While the mystics of Safed charted the new course of Judaism, Christian Europe was undergoing its own religious revolution. The Protestant Reformation had begun all the way back in 1517, when the German priest and professor Martin Luther proposed a disputation to address the corruption of the Catholic Church. In the ensuing Diet of Worms, the Catholic Church confidently declared victory by default. But unlike with the Jewish disputations, Luther's ideas actually enjoyed some popularity among the general Christian public. By the middle of the century, more breakaway sects had emerged, ranging from the radical orthopraxy of Anabaptism to the Catholic in all but name Church of England. With entire countries beginning to take up the Protestant banner, the political map of Europe was turned upside down. And toward the end of the 16th century, all eyes were on Holland. Early on in the Reformation, basically every kind of Protestantism had taken hold in the Netherlands, a collection of small states on the edge of the Holy Roman Empire. However, that same territory had recently been inherited by the Spanish crown, which had styled itself as the foremost defender of the Catholic Church, and accordingly responded with an iron fist. Dutch noblemen were deposed, taxes were severely raised, and the Spanish Inquisition was upgraded to nearly the icon of religious terror that we know today. But much of the Netherlands successfully resisted Spanish rule, breaking away completely in 1581 as the Union of Utrecht, and acquiring assistance from other Protestant countries to declare independence as the Dutch Republic in 1588. But where other Protestant nations simply replaced a Catholic theocracy for a Protestant one, the Dutch, with their wild mix of varying churches, established a new order ensuring religious freedom for everyone in their lands. I don't want to undercut the monumental importance that this religious tolerance represented, but it wasn't just a case of being the bigger man. The Dutch Republic was a small, strategically vulnerable country surrounded by enemies, with limited recognition and no natural resources. I could never imagine what that's like. In order to maintain their independence, not just from the Spanish but also their ostensible allies, the Dutch needed a network of experienced merchants to establish international trade. Perhaps the kind of people who might appreciate some religious freedom. Now, to be totally clear, the Dutch trading empire was not wholly or even mostly of Jewish origin. The Dutch East India Company definitely wasn't. And when the first Jews arrived in Amsterdam in 1593, they had already been refused entry to other Dutch cities. Religious freedom was the law. It was not the prevailing culture. But you couldn't have come up with a more perfect escape for Portugal's hidden Jews, and by the 1610s, Amsterdam was already one of the greatest Jewish centers of the world. Nevertheless, this newfound freedom also brought conflict. After a century in hiding, not all conversos had maintained the same level of devotion to Jewish law. What's more, Judaism had moved on in their absence. For the most part, these people's knowledge of Judaism only extended as far as the best-known works of Maimonides, if that. Jewish books had been banned in Portugal, and conversos had begun to substitute actual Jewish rituals for whatever scraps of their former culture could still be remembered. They knew nothing of Safed or Luria or the Shulchan Aruch. In their eagerness to reconnect with Judaism, most of Amsterdam's Jews embraced these new developments, but not all of them. In 1614, a 29-year-old Portuguese converso arrived in Hamburg under the name Adam Romes. However, Adam Romes was an alias. His real name was Uriel da Costa, and he was a wanted fugitive, a former tax collector who had financed his family's escape from Portugal through embezzlement. Despite da Costa's shady dealings, he was genuinely eager to return to Judaism. He knew the Old Testament front to back, as it had been the only Jewish text legally available in Portugal. He had even received an adult circumcision during a stopover in Amsterdam. But in Hamburg, he was immediately disillusioned with the rampant legalism, mysticism, and bureaucracy which he found in every corner of Jewish life. This was not the Judaism of his imagination, and unable to hold his tongue, Da Costa published Propositions Against the Tradition, an 11-part critique of the disparity between the literal word of the Torah and its modern interpretation. Da Costa's original critique has since been lost, and intentionally so, for it earned him a cherem not only in Hamburg but also in Venice, the main center of Jewish publishing, which had previously released the Shulchan Aruch. Contrary to the prevailing conventions of Hebrew to English translation, a cherem is not an excommunication, usually. The most common form of cherem consisted of a temporary banishment from the local Jewish community for contempt of the local court. There was always the possibility of reconciliation. But even this may have been too harsh. Based on Da Costa's surviving writings, historians speculate that he suffered from either bipolar disorder or severe depression. It's impossible to know for sure. What we do know is that Da Costa was proud to be Jewish, but he had no interest in a community that wouldn't accept his questioning. In 1623, Da Costa moved to Amsterdam, where most of his family was already living. But far from a relief, the Jewish court of Amsterdam was even more centralized and bureaucratic, with just one synagogue presiding over a Jewish community in the thousands. This time, instead of a short pamphlet, Da Costa printed a meticulously researched 200-page epic, an examination of Pharisaic traditions, in which he wrote off all non-biblical Jewish traditions as mindless conventions, devoid of any spiritual value, and especially denounced the idea of the immortality of the soul. The book was condemned, not only as an attack on Judaism, but on all religion, and it was ordered to be burned. A complete surviving copy was only rediscovered in 1990. Again unwilling to recant, Da Costa went into exile in Utrecht, during which time his mother died and then his wife. They had been the only people in his family to tolerate his dissents. Everyone else had become his enemy. And rather than face complete isolation, in 1633, Da Costa returned to Amsterdam, choosing to practice Jewish orthodoxy but without conviction. His self-described punishment lasted 7 years. In 1640, 2 Christians, Italian and Spanish traders, expressed to Da Costa their interest in converting to Judaism. Da Costa discouraged them from doing so, which is actually pretty normal, if you're a rabbi who officiates conversions. But in turning these men down, Da Costa wasn't testing their willingness to convert. He was expressing a conclusion which had been in his heart since his choice to return to the community, that there was no truth to be found in religion. Not in Judaism, not in Christianity. No immortal soul, no Torah handed down to Moses, no commandments, no miracles. When word of this returned to the rabbinate, he received his 4th and final cherem. He was subjected to a round of lashings in front of the congregation, and then instructed to lie down while they walked over his back. When he returned home, he wrote down a 10-page summary of his life and beliefs in Latin, and shot himself. By the time of Da Costa's death, the European wars of religion had escalated into what was later known as the 30 Years' War. The deadliest conflict in European history up to that point, the war killed 10% of the continent's population. However, as the fighting came to an end, largely in favor of those countries who had supported the Protestant cause, a new order of European politics emerged which saw the political power of the Catholic Church decline, while national politics, even in Protestant countries with their own national churches, became increasingly detached from religion. Accordingly, the Dutch policy of toleration for Jews began to spread to other nearby countries. Although Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, a handful of individual Jewish families had lived in London on and off during the reigns of King Henry VII and his granddaughter Elizabeth I. During the 30 Years' War, English Puritans led by Oliver Cromwell had abolished the monarchy in favor of a republic. And although Cromwell committed horrific atrocities against Catholics and Quakers, he was persuaded, partly by the economic success of Amsterdam, partly out of spite for the Catholic Church, and partly due to lobbying by the Dutch, to allow Jews back into England. And despite the eventual restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, King Charles II allowed them to stay. This revolution in Jewish acceptance wasn't entirely limited to Protestant nations either. France, though devoutly Catholic, had sided with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War in order to weaken its rivals, Spain and Austria. With the war's end, France was awarded control over most of Alsace and Lorraine, and the 10-year-old King Louis XIV refrained from expelling his new Jewish subjects there, eventually placing Jews under his full protection in 1675. Nevertheless, Amsterdam remained the center of the new Jewish West. In 1648, more so-called Portuguese Jews had been born in Amsterdam than in Portugal, and although Uriel da Costa could never have imagined it, within a century, the character of that community would more closely resemble him than the rabbis who had sealed his downfall. See, while Rabbinic Judaism does affirm the immortality of the soul, the implications of that are little explored and generally not considered that important. Although centuries of debate and study have upheld the belief in divine reward and retribution in the world to come, Jewish concepts of the afterlife remain vague and nebulous, since, nobody's ever come back to tell us what it's like. Much more important to Jewish moral philosophy is the belief that our actions have consequences in this life. Whether or not you're on the receiving end of those consequences, they are happening in the world. Therefore, it behooves us as Jews to create good by doing good, through empathy, charity, health, self-respect, and adherence to Jewish ritual. Now, leaving aside some of the specifics of Jewish ritual, that might all sound pretty reasonable. In fact, that basic moral philosophy doesn't really necessitate a belief in divine revelation at all. Judaism, while professing miracles in the Bible, doesn't really have the concept of a personal relationship with God, so why not dispense with the entire idea that God is playing an active part at all? In Amsterdam, this was a question whose time had come. By the middle of the 17th century, the foremost rabbi in Western Europe was Amsterdam's own Manuel Diaz Soeiro, better remembered today as Menashe ben Yisrael. Supplanting Venice as the largest publisher of Hebrew books, palling around with the likes of Grotius and Rembrandt, and engaging in soft diplomacy on behalf of the Dutch Republic. It was he who lobbied Cromwell to allow Jews back into England, and he hoped to do the same in Scandinavia. But it was his work in the Keter Yeshiva that would prove the most influential. In 1645, Soeiro took on a student of unparalleled brilliance, a teenage boy whom he believed would eventually take his place at the forefront of Western European Jewry. Alas, in 1649, that student was forced to drop out of the yeshiva in order to take over his family's business. His name was Bento de Spinoza. However, Spinoza proved quite inept at the family business and just 4 years later returned to the yeshiva under the tutelage of its founder, Sol Mortera. By this time, Soeiro had moved to England. Of particular interest to Spinoza were the writings of Maimonides, especially his invocations against cults of personality and his efforts to reconcile the laws of God with the immutable laws of nature. While studying the Mishneh Torah by day, Spinoza also sought out a secular education under Franciscus van den Enden, a former Jesuit who introduced Spinoza to the philosophy of René Descartes. In his Discourse on the Method, Descartes, though not Jewish, cited existence itself as proof of a divine creator. Descartes believed that God wouldn't allow the existence of truths that couldn't be proven, either through reasoning or experimentation. However, as a good Catholic, he also considered it possible to use this approach to prove his pre-existing belief in an omnibenevolent God. And even as an upstanding member of Amsterdam's Jewish life, Spinoza began taking Cartesian skepticism to the next level. To be clear, the Jewish community didn't consider there to be anything wrong with getting a secular education alongside a Jewish one, and Spinoza was very open about his studies. But in 1656, two of his closest friends asked him what he actually believed, and perhaps unwisely, he gave them his conclusions. That the soul was not immortal, that the existence of God was purely philosophical, and that the Torah was not handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai, but instead conceived by mortal men. Keep in mind, only 16 years had passed since the final humiliation of Uriel da Costa. Spinoza had been around for it. His teachers were among the rabbis who had carried it out. So it shouldn't be surprising that Spinoza's friends urgently reported to the rabbinate, "It's happening again." In what can only be described as sheer panic, the rabbinate brought Spinoza before them on the 27th of July and issued the following decree. The gentlemen of the Ma'amad hereby proclaim that they have long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, and that they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and, on the contrary, daily receiving ever more serious information about the abominable heresies that he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds, and having numerous trustworthy witnesses to this effect in the presence of the said Espinosa, they have become convinced of this matter. And after all of this has been investigated in the presence of the honorable sages, they have decided, with their consent, that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. By decree of the angels and by the command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Espinoza. With the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of the entire holy congregation, and in front of those holy scrolls with the 613 precepts which are written therein, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and the curse which Elisha cursed the boys, and with all the castigations which are written in the book of the law. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man. And all the curses of the covenant that are written into this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written into this book of the law. But that you cleave unto the Lord your God are alive every one of you this day. This was the most extreme cherem ever issued by a Jewish court, and it was issued against a 23-year-old first-time offender with no published works to his name. Somehow unfazed by the prospect of being ostracized by his friends and family forever, Spinoza moved out of Amsterdam, became a lens grinder, and took his free time away from the synagogue to begin work on his 5-volume magnum opus Ethics. It is extremely long and nobody's actually read it. But that's okay because it isn't strictly relevant to our story, as in 1665, Spinoza abruptly stopped his work on ethics to address what he saw as a pressing issue of the day. See, after the 30 Years' War, Dutch politics had become fiercely divided between the Liberal States Party, which supported upholding the federal ideals of the Dutch Republic, and the conservative Orangist Party, which supported restoring the de facto monarchy which had led the country through the struggle for independence. They even had their own factions within the Dutch Reformed Church, with collegiants wanting to distance the church from matters of state, and Voetians seeking to increase the church's political power. For most of Spinoza's adult life, the States Party had held the majority, with Johan de Witt as basically president. But in 1665, as the Netherlands found itself at war with England, the Orangists began to gain popularity. And while the Dutch Reformed Church didn't constitute a religious majority in the country, nor did any other church, religious leaders of all stripes came to unite against a common enemy: the atheistic whispers of the Jewish-born Spinoza. But Spinoza was not an atheist, and it was this accusation that led him to compose the Theological Political Treatise. His issue was not with religion, he wrote, but rather with the way in which powerful men wielded religion in order to suppress the pursuit of knowledge. Political freedom, therefore, could only be achieved when religious institutions were no longer politically empowered. In the treatise, Spinoza stated his personal theology as such: that a belief in miracles merely betrayed our own lack of understanding of nature, which must be investigated without fear of religious coercion; that the prophets were merely charismatic men with big imaginations; and most of all, that the Bible was a work of men, many of them, across multiple places and eras and often in conflict with each other. Spinoza maintained that there was moral truth in the Bible, but that it can only be distilled to its essence when analyzed with clear eyes. In other words, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. Let it never be said that Spinoza wasn't still Jewish. For although many of his ideas were neither wholly original nor exclusively Jewish, he was hardly the only thinker of his time to advocate for historical criticism of the Bible. One of his particular issues in the treatise was deeply relevant to the Jewish world of his time: the rejection of chosenness. Judaism doesn't claim to be the one true religion. Rather, Jewish thought sees all people of the world as having a path to God so long as they adhere to basic morality. However, God has specially entered a contract with the Jewish nation to follow the Torah, and all of its very specific and often mysterious rules. We may not understand all of them, but, going back to my earlier description, God promises us that they do have the power to create good in the world, just in a way that goes beyond our understanding. This is why, throughout Jewish history, rabbinical literature has characterized the survival of the Jewish people as a sign of our covenant with God, and our various persecutions as the result of our struggle to uphold that covenant. Here's what Spinoza had to say about that. The only things the Hebrews had over other nations were that they handled security matters in ways that worked out well, and that they overcame great dangers, in most cases purely by God's external aid. And we don't see that God promised the patriarchs or their successors anything more than this. The purpose of every society and every state is to live securely and well, and a state can't survive unless it has laws by which each person is bound. If all the members of one society chose to abandon its laws, they'll be dissolving the society and destroying the state. Conversely, no more certain punishment for obstinacy could be predicted than the ruin of the state, and the evils that would follow from that. Some would be the results of the ruin of any state. Others would be specially for them because of the special features of their state. There's no need to say more about this here. Spinoza was saying that the Torah was literally the constitution of Judea, and a constitution for a state that no longer exists is just paper. From this, Spinoza concluded that the survival of the Jewish people since losing that state had not been driven by a covenant with God, but by political savvy, dumb luck, and relentless intolerance on the part of their host nations. He did remain open to the possibility that the Jewish state could be re-established, but that it would only be possible if the Jewish people took responsibility for their own destiny by breaking the cycle of religious orthodoxy. The implications of this were horrifying. In the minds of the rabbis of Safed, misfortune was always seen as part of God's plan, an unknowable but integral step in the long path towards the world to come. And there'd been a lot of misfortune. It's precisely because of that belief that Kabbalah flourished in the aftermath of the Alhambra decree. For what else could a tragedy of that magnitude portend but the coming of the Messiah? But in a rational, self-maintaining world, as Spinoza posits, how can it be in our interest to take centuries of cruelty on the chin, to ignore the evils of the present in favor of ancient hopes for an unproven future? Spinoza did not live to see how the Jewish world would answer that question. He published the treatise in 1670. 2 years later, Johann de Witt was killed and eaten by an angry mob of Orangists. The dictatorship of the House of Orange was restored, and under their leadership, the theological political treatise was banned. Spinoza died of lung disease in 1677, after which his Ethics was released to the public. In 2015, the Chief Rabbinate of Amsterdam put together an expert panel to investigate whether to overturn Spinoza's banishment. The panel overwhelmingly concluded that it should be, but the presiding rabbi declined. It doesn't matter. We're living in Spinoza's world. Within a century of his death, the majority of Jews in Western Europe were what we now call secular Jews. Today, we're the majority worldwide. And in order to understand how it all could have changed so quickly, you need to know what was happening at the very same time in Eastern Europe. Special thanks to my patrons, including Eric Atreides, Jeremy Biskin, Osher Gordon, James Majors, Corey Ard, Matthew Brotman, Lev Ham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, JP Strathausen, Navet Tal, Useful Charts, and All Weiss.